Sarah Morgan felt the world crumble beneath her feet as she watched her husband ride away with Elizabeth Dalton, the wealthy rancher's daughter, leaving nothing behind but a hastily scrawled note and 5 years of marriage scattered to the prairie winds. It was the summer of 1875 in the dusty town of Clearwater Springs, Wyoming Territory, and at 26, Sarah found herself standing alone on the porch of what was no longer their home, clutching the paper that had shattered her world. Properties in foreclosure, the bank manager had informed her just hours after finding the note. Your husband took out loans he never repaid. I'm afraid you have 2 weeks to vacate. The June sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah trudged back toward the small house she would soon lose. Clearwater Springs had seemed like paradise when she and James had arrived from Illinois. Now it felt like a cage, with every face in town either pitying or judgmental. Tears streaked down her face as she pushed open the door to the house. 5 years of memories surrounded her: the quilt her mother had made for their wedding, the wooden rocking chair James had crafted when they thought children would soon follow. Children that never came. Perhaps that was why he'd left. Perhaps Elizabeth could give him what she couldn't. Sarah sank to her knees, allowing herself one moment of complete despair before wiping her eyes. There was no time for tears. She had 2 weeks to figure out where to go and how to survive. The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn and dressed quickly. She'd spent a sleepless night making plans. With no family to turn to and limited options for a woman alone, she knew she needed work immediately. The town was just stirring as she made her way to Harriet's Cafe, the only establishment in Clearwater Springs owned by a woman. Harriet Mason had always been kind to her, and Sarah hoped she might need help. The bell over the door jangled as she entered. Harriet looked up from where she was setting out fresh pies, her eyes softening when she saw Sarah. I heard about James, Harriet said, wiping her hands on her apron. That man never deserved you. Sarah swallowed hard. I need work, Harriet. The bank's taking the house. Harriet shook her head. That no-good husband of yours left you with nothing but debts, didn't he? She sighed. I wish I could help, dear, but business has been slow. I can barely keep myself afloat. Sarah nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. I understand. If you hear of anything. There is one thing, Harriet said hesitantly. The Pine Ridge Ranch is looking for a cook. Owner just hired a bunch of new hands for the season. But it's 15 miles out of town, and Marshall Prescott has a reputation for being difficult. I'll take anything at this point, Sarah said firmly. Harriet looked concerned. If you're sure. Talk to Thomas Evans, Prescott's foreman. He comes to town for supplies today. I'll tell him to expect you. Sarah spent the morning in a flurry of activity, gathering what possessions she could sell and preparing for what might be her only chance at employment. By noon, she was waiting nervously at the general store, watching for the Pine Ridge foreman. She spotted him immediately when he arrived, tall and broad-shouldered with a quiet authority that made other men step aside. His dark hair was cropped short beneath his hat, and his face was tanned from long days in the sun. He couldn't have been more than 30, yet there was a weathered quality to him that spoke of hard experience. Mr. Evans, she approached cautiously.
I'm Sarah Morgan.
Harriet said you might be looking for a cook at Pine Ridge. Thomas Evans studied her with piercing blue eyes. Mrs. Morgan. He nodded politely. Harriet mentioned you. You have experience cooking for large groups? I managed the household for 5 years and often hosted my husband's business associates, Sarah said, omitting that James had usually criticized her efforts afterward. I'm a fast learner, and I work hard. Thomas seemed to consider this. Pine Ridge is no place for fancy manners, madam. It's rough country and rougher men. 15 cowboys who want hearty food and plenty of it. I understand, Sarah said firmly. I'm not afraid of hard work. Something in her expression must have convinced him. We can offer room and board plus $20 a month. If it doesn't work out, we'll bring you back to town. It was less than she'd hoped, but beggars couldn't be choosers. When can I start? Today, if you're able. We're heading back after I finish here. His gaze softened slightly. I heard about your situation, Mrs. Morgan.
I'm sorry.
The kindness in his voice nearly broke her composure. Thank you, Mr. Evans. I'll be ready in an hour. As Sarah hurried back to pack her few remaining belongings, she felt a strange mixture of terror and relief. She was leaving behind the life she'd built with James, but perhaps that was for the best. There was nothing left for her in Clearwater Springs but whispers and pity. True to his word, Thomas Evans was waiting with the supply wagon when she returned. He helped her up onto the seat with a gentle courtesy that surprised her after James's increasing coldness over the past year. It's a rough ride, he warned as he climbed up beside her. Roads not much more than a trail in some parts. The wagon lurched forward, and Sarah gripped the edge of the seat. As Clearwater Springs receded behind them, she felt a weight lifting. Whatever waited at Pine Ridge Ranch, it had to be better than watching neighbors avert their eyes when they saw her coming. The journey was indeed rough. They traveled through rolling hills that gradually gave way to more rugged terrain. Thomas was quiet for the most part, occasionally pointing out landmarks or warning her of a particularly jarring stretch ahead. Have you worked for Mr. Prescott long? Sarah asked, trying to learn something about her new employer. 5 years, Thomas replied. He's a fair man, but particular. Expects things done right the first time. And the men? What should I expect? Thomas glanced at her. They're good cowboys, hard workers. Some are a bit rough around the edges, but they'll respect you as long as you feed them well. He paused. I won't let anyone trouble you, Mrs. Morgan. Something in his tone made Sarah believe him completely. For the first time in days, she felt a small measure of security. The sun was beginning to set when they finally crested a hill, and Sarah got her first view of Pine Ridge Ranch. The main house was larger than she'd expected, a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch. Behind it stretched a bunkhouse, barn, corrals, and various outbuildings, all nestled in a valley with pine-covered ridges rising in the distance. It's beautiful, Sarah murmured. Thomas nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. Best ranch in the territory. As they approached, men began to emerge from the various buildings, curious about the newcomer. Sarah straightened her back, suddenly conscious of her travel-worn appearance and the reality of being the only woman among so many men. Thomas seemed to sense her discomfort. Don't worry, he said quietly. They'll mind their manners. He helped her down from the wagon and led her toward the main house, where a stern-looking man in his 50s stood waiting on the porch. Marshall Prescott had the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in the elements, with gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Mr. Prescott, this is Mrs. Sarah Morgan. Thomas introduced her. Mrs. Morgan, Marshall Prescott, owner of Pine Ridge Ranch. Prescott eyed her critically. You know how to cook, Mrs. Morgan? Yes, sir, Sarah replied firmly. We start breakfast at 5. Dinner at noon. Supper at 6. He spoke brusquely. Cook shack's behind the main house. Your quarters are attached. Evans will show you. With that, he turned and went back inside. Thomas gave her an apologetic look. He's not one for conversation. He gestured for her to follow him. I'll show you where you'll be staying. The cook shack was a sturdy building with a large kitchen area equipped with a massive cast-iron stove, long preparation tables, and ample storage. A small but comfortable room adjoined it, simply furnished with a bed, dresser, and washstand. It's not fancy, Thomas said, but it's private. Lock's good and strong, too. He set her bag on the bed. I'll have the boys bring water for washing up. Pantry stocked, but if you need anything special, make a list. We send to town every week. Sarah looked around at what would be her home for the foreseeable future. It was clean and solid, far better than she'd expected. Thank you, Mr. Evans. Thomas, he corrected her. Everyone here uses first names except for Mr. Prescott. He hesitated at the door. "First day's always the hardest, Mrs. Morgan. It gets easier." After he left, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, overcome by the events of the past few days. She allowed herself a few tears before washing her face and unpacking her meager belongings. Tomorrow would come early, and she was determined to prove herself. Despite her exhaustion, Sarah woke before dawn the next morning. She dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, lighting lamps and stoking the fire in the massive stove. The pantry was indeed well stocked, and she set to work preparing a breakfast of flapjacks, bacon, eggs, and biscuits. By the time Boots began to shuffle into the dining area, she had steaming platters of food ready. The cowboys filed in, eyeing her curiously but respectfully. Thomas entered last, giving her a small nod of encouragement. "Men, this is Mrs. Morgan," he announced. "She'll be cooking for us from now on. You'll treat her with respect or answer to me." There were murmured greetings as the men took their seats. Sarah served them efficiently, listening to their conversations to learn names and personalities. Most seemed decent enough, though a few watched her with unsettling interest. One cowboy in particular, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, made her uncomfortable with his lingering gaze. "Ain't had a pretty face around here in a long time," he remarked to no one in particular. "Makes a man remember what he's been missing." Thomas fixed him with a hard stare. "That's enough, Miller." The man shrugged but fell silent. Sarah continued serving, grateful for Thomas's intervention but aware that she'd need to establish her own boundaries if she was to survive here. As the days passed, Sarah settled into the rhythm of ranch life. She woke before dawn, prepared 3 hearty meals, kept the kitchen spotless, and fell into bed exhausted each night. The work was hard but satisfying in its simplicity, and the distance from Clearwater Springs gave her space to begin healing. Most of the cowboys were respectful, some even shy around her. A few, like young Billy, who couldn't be more than 18, would linger to help with heavy lifting or bringing in firewood. Thomas often appeared at mealtimes to check on her, his quiet presence becoming a comfort in her new routine. A week into her employment, Sarah was kneading dough for the evening bread when Thomas entered the kitchen with a package. "Mail came from town," he said, setting it on the table. "This has your name on it." Sarah wiped her hands and examined the parcel. It was from Harriet, containing a few personal items Sarah had left behind in her haste, along with a note. "Dear Sarah, the whole town is talking about James running off with that Dalton girl. Her father is furious. Apparently, they took quite a sum of his money, too. Some are saying they headed to California. I hope you're settling in at Pine Ridge. Be careful around those cowboys, especially Miller. He has a reputation. Your friend, Harriet." Sarah folded the note carefully. So James hadn't just abandoned her, he was a thief as well. Somehow, this final betrayal felt almost liberating. The man she'd loved, or thought she had, was truly gone. Thomas had remained by the door, watching her reaction. "Bad news." "No," Sarah replied, surprisingly truthful. "Just confirmation of things I already suspected." She returned to her bread dough, pounding it with renewed vigor. Thomas leaned against the doorframe. "First cattle drive of the season, leaves tomorrow. Be gone about 3 weeks." He seemed hesitant. "It'll be quiet around here. Just you, Mr. Prescott, and a couple of hands staying behind." Sarah looked up. "Will you be going?"
Yes.
"I lead the drives." He studied her face. "You'll be all right?" His concern touched her. "I'll be fine. It might be nice to cook for fewer mouths for a while." Thomas nodded but lingered. "Miller stays behind. Keep your door locked at night." The warning sent a chill through her, but she appreciated his honesty. "I will." The next morning, Sarah rose earlier than usual to prepare provisions for the departing cowboys. As they gathered their gear and mounted up, she stood by the kitchen door, watching the organized chaos of the departure. Thomas rode over to where she stood, his horse dancing beneath him. In the early morning light, with his dark hair curling from beneath his hat and his strong profile outlined against the sky, Sarah was struck by how handsome he was, a thought that immediately brought guilt and confusion. "We'll be back before July ends," he said, looking down at her from the saddle. "Take care, Sarah." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it affected her more than it should have. "Be safe, Thomas." He nodded, holding her gaze for a moment longer than necessary before turning his horse and calling out commands to the waiting men. Sarah watched until the dust from the cattle drive had faded into the distance. The ranch was indeed quieter, without most of the cowboys. Sarah appreciated the reduced workload but found the silence sometimes oppressive. Mr. Prescott rarely spoke beyond giving instructions, and the remaining hands kept to themselves except for Miller, who seemed to find more and more reasons to visit the kitchen. "Don't see why you're wasting such fine cooking on the old man," Miller remarked one afternoon as Sarah prepared supper. "He can barely taste it anymore." Sarah continued working, keeping the table between them.
Mr. Prescott paye my wage.
"I'm happy to cook what he likes." Miller moved closer. "Pretty woman like you shouldn't be hidden away in a kitchen. Evans know what a beauty he brought to Pine Ridge." "Mr. Evans hired me for my cooking skills," Sarah replied firmly. "I'd appreciate it if you'd let me finish my work." Miller's smile didn't reach his eyes.
Course.
"Just being friendly." He backed toward the door. "Gets lonely out here is all. Thought you might appreciate the company." After he left, Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she had to set down the knife she'd been using. She'd dealt with unwanted attention before, but never in such isolation. She found herself counting the days until Thomas and the others returned. 2 weeks after the cattle drive departed, Sarah was gathering eggs from the henhouse when she heard horses approaching. Thinking Thomas might have returned early, she hurried toward the main yard, only to stop short at the sight of 3 unfamiliar riders. They weren't cowboys, at least not working ones. Their clothes were too fine, their manner too casual as they dismounted and looked around the quiet ranch yard. One was older with a silver mustache, while the other 2 were younger men with hard eyes. Sarah retreated to the kitchen door, hoping they hadn't noticed her. But the older man called out, "Hello there, miss. Might we trouble you for some water for our horses?" Reluctantly, Sarah stepped forward. "Of course. The pump's by the barn. Help yourselves." The older man approached, removing his hat. His smile seemed genuine enough, but something about him made Sarah uneasy. "Much obliged."
I'm Howard Blackwell.
"These are my associates, Parker and Jenkins. We're looking for Marshall Prescott." "Mr. Prescott is out checking the north pasture," Sarah replied, keeping her distance. "He should return by supper time." Blackwell nodded. "We'll wait, if that's acceptable. We have business to discuss." Before Sarah could respond, Miller emerged from the bunkhouse. "Mr. Blackwell," he greeted the man with familiar ease that immediately raised Sarah's suspicions. "Didn't expect you for another week." "Plans change, Miller," Blackwell replied smoothly. "Is everything prepared?" Miller glanced at Sarah. "Not quite. Had some distractions." The exchange confirmed Sarah's instinct that these men meant trouble. "I'll inform Mr. Prescott you're waiting when he returns," she said, backing toward the kitchen. "Excuse me, I have work to attend to." Inside, Sarah's mind raced. The way Miller had greeted Blackwell suggested they knew each other well, that Miller had been expecting them. And what had he meant by distractions? She moved to the small window that overlooked the yard, watching as Miller led the men to the bunkhouse, talking in low voices. Whatever their business with Mr. Prescott, Sarah doubted it was legitimate. When Mr. Prescott returned 2 hours later, Sarah intercepted him before he could reach the bunkhouse. "Mr. Prescott, there are men waiting to see you." They arrived with Miller. The older man frowned. "What men? Did they give names?" "One called himself Howard Blackwell," Sarah replied. "He had 2 others with him." Prescott's face hardened. Mrs. Morgan, I want you to go to your quarters, lock the door, and stay there until I come for you. Do you understand? What's happening? Sarah asked, alarmed by his reaction. Blackwell's been trying to buy my ranch for 2 years, Prescott said grimly. When I wouldn't sell, he started threatening. Last month, cattle went missing. Found some of my fences cut. He glanced toward the bunkhouse. Looks like Miller's been working for him. Sarah felt a chill. Should we send for help? No time, Prescott said. Go to your room. If anything happens, there's a trapdoor under the rug. It leads to a root cellar. Stay hidden until Thomas returns. Sarah hurried to her quarters, heart pounding. Through her window, she could see Prescott striding toward the bunkhouse, his posture rigid with anger. She paced anxiously, straining to hear what was happening. The sound of raised voices reached her, followed by a gunshot that made her jump. Then silence. Terrified, Sarah pulled back the rug and found the trapdoor Prescott had mentioned. She had just lifted it when her door burst open. Miller stood there, a pistol in his hand and a cruel smile on his face. Going somewhere, Mrs. Morgan? That won't do at all. He gestured with the gun. Come along now. Mr. Blackwell wants a word. With no choice, Sarah followed him to the main house. In the parlor, Blackwell sat comfortably in Prescott's chair. The 2 other men stood nearby, while Prescott himself was seated, holding a bloodied cloth to his shoulder. Mrs. Morgan, Blackwell greeted her with mock courtesy. I apologize for the disruption. Mr. Prescott and I had a disagreement about the ownership of this fine ranch. Fortunately, he's decided to sign it over to me. Under duress and gunpoint, Prescott growled. It won't stand in court. Blackwell smiled. By the time anyone investigates, we'll have established ourselves quite thoroughly. It's amazing how a few months of possession can confuse property records. He turned to Sarah. Now, as for you, my dear, we'll need someone to cook for us while we settle in. I won't work for thieves, Sarah said firmly, though her voice shook. Brave words, Blackwell replied, his smile fading. But ultimately foolish. Miller seems quite taken with you. I'd hate to leave you to his tender mercies, but business is business. Miller moved closer, his hand reaching for her arm. We'll get along fine once she understands how things are now. Sarah stepped back, bumping into one of Blackwell's men who grabbed her shoulders. Prescott tried to rise but was shoved back down. Leave her be, the older rancher demanded. She's got nothing to do with this. On the contrary, Blackwell replied. Every ranch needs a woman's touch. And Miller here has been quite lonely. Sarah's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out of this nightmare. The cattle drive wasn't due back for days. By then, these men would have firmly established themselves, perhaps disposed of Prescott, and she would be at Miller's mercy. Put her in the storeroom for now, Blackwell ordered. We'll decide what to do with her after we've secured everything. Miller grabbed her arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh as he dragged her toward the door. Sarah struggled, but his grip only tightened. Best get used to following orders, he hissed in her ear. Things are different now. He pushed her into a small storeroom off the kitchen and locked the door. Sarah immediately searched for a weapon or means of escape, but the room contained only preserved foods and kitchen supplies. The single high window was too small for her to fit through. Hours passed. Sarah heard movement throughout the house as Blackwell and his men made themselves at home. Occasionally, voices raised an argument, though she couldn't make out the words. As darkness fell, the house grew quieter. Sarah had almost dozed off when the lock clicked. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing a heavy jar as a makeshift weapon. The door opened to reveal Miller, a bottle in his hand and a dangerous look in his eyes. Time we got better acquainted, he slurred, stepping into the small space. Now that the boss is sleeping it off. Sarah raised the jar. Stay away from me. Miller laughed. Feisty. I like that. He lunged forward, knocking the jar from her hand. It shattered against the wall as he pinned her against the shelves. "Your husband was a fool to leave you behind. But lucky for me. Let me go." Sarah struggled against his grip, the smell of whiskey on his breath making her stomach turn. Miller's hand closed around her throat. "You'll learn to." The rest of his sentence was cut off by the sound of breaking glass from the main house, followed by a shout and a gunshot. Miller's head snapped toward the door. "What the hell?" More gunfire erupted. Miller cursed, releasing Sarah to draw his pistol. "Stay put if you want to live," he warned, backing out of the storeroom. The moment he was gone, Sarah searched frantically for a weapon. Finding a broken bottleneck from the shattered jar, she clutched it tightly and pressed her ear to the door. The sounds of a struggle continued, furniture breaking, men shouting, more gunshots. Then silence fell. Sarah held her breath, straining to hear any indication of who had prevailed. Footsteps approached, heavy boots moving purposefully across the wooden floor. The lock rattled, and Sarah raised her makeshift weapon, prepared to fight to the death rather than submit to Miller. The door swung open. Thomas Evans stood there, his face streaked with dirt and blood, a revolver in his hand. Behind him, several of the Pine Ridge Cowboys were securing Blackwell and his remaining man, Sarah. His voice was rough with emotion. "Are you hurt?" The relief that flooded through her was so overwhelming that her knees buckled. Thomas caught her before she could fall, his strong arms encircling her protectively. "You came back early," she whispered, clinging to him. "Got word from town that Blackwell was heading this way," Thomas explained, leading her from the storeroom. "Rode ahead with a few men while the others continued with the herd."
His jaw tightened.
"If we'd been any later." In the main room, Sarah saw Miller's body sprawled near the fireplace. Prescott sat in his chair, his wounded shoulder freshly bandaged. Blackwell and one of his men were tied securely, while the other lay dead near the door. "Mr. Prescott insisted we come back," Thomas told her. "Said he had a bad feeling about Miller." His arms tightened around her. "Thank God we listened." The next few hours passed in a blur as the sheriff was summoned from the nearest town. Statements were taken, and the bodies removed. Blackwell and his surviving associate were taken into custody, facing charges of attempted murder, extortion, and land theft. By dawn, the ranch was quiet again. Sarah sat on the porch, a blanket around her shoulders, watching the sunrise. Thomas settled beside her, offering a cup of coffee. "How's Mr. Prescott?" she asked, accepting the cup gratefully. "Resting. Doctor says he'll recover." Thomas studied her face with concern. "What about you?" Sarah considered the question. The terror of the previous day still lingered, but beneath it was a surprising sense of strength. She had survived her husband's abandonment, the loss of her home, and now this. "I'll be all right," she said honestly. Thomas nodded, his gaze returning to the horizon. "Mr. Prescott asked me to thank you. Said your warning gave him time to hide some papers. Blackwell wanted deeds to water rights that would have given them control of the whole valley." "I just wish I could have done more," Sarah murmured. "You did plenty," Thomas assured her. He hesitated, then added quietly, "When I saw Miller dragging you to that storeroom, I've never been so afraid in my life." The emotion in his voice made Sarah turn to look at him. In the soft light of dawn, his face was open, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "You saved my life," she said simply. Thomas shook his head. "I did what any decent man would do." He stared into his coffee cup. "When we heard about Blackwell heading this way, all I could think about was getting back to you. Not the ranch, not Mr. Prescott. You." The admission hung between them, fraught with meaning. Sarah felt her heart quicken. It was too soon after James, too raw, and yet this man beside her had proven himself honorable in every way her husband had not. "I should go start breakfast," she said, unsure how to respond. Thomas caught her hand as she rose. "Sarah." His voice was gentle. "I know it's not my place to say this. You're still healing from what your husband did. But I want you to know that not all men are like him. Some of us know the value of a good woman." Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. "I'm beginning to see that." He released her hand reluctantly. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." In the days that followed, the ranch slowly returned to normal. The cattle drive had been successful, bringing much-needed income, and Mr. Prescott recovered quickly from his wound. The Cowboys treated Sarah with even greater respect after learning how she'd stood up to Blackwell and Miller. Thomas was true to his word, giving Sarah space while remaining a steadfast presence. He never pushed or presumed, but she often caught him watching her with an expression that made her heart flutter. A month after the incident, Sarah received a letter forwarded from Clearwater Springs. It was from James, writing from San Francisco, asking for forgiveness and claiming he'd made a terrible mistake. Elizabeth had left him after their money ran out, and he wanted to come home. Sarah read the letter twice, searching for any feeling beyond contempt. There was none. The man who had once been the center of her world now seemed like a stranger, weak and selfish in ways she could finally see clearly. That evening, she showed the letter to Thomas as they sat on the porch after supper. It had become their custom to spend this quiet time together, watching the sunset and talking about their days. Thomas read it silently, his expression darkening. "What will you do?" he asked, handing it back. Sarah took the letter and methodically tore it into tiny pieces, letting them scatter in the evening breeze. "Nothing. That chapter of my life is closed." Thomas nodded, relief evident in his eyes. "You deserve better than him." "I'm starting to believe that," Sarah replied softly. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. The night was clear, stars emerging one by one in the vast Wyoming sky. In the distance, coyotes called to one another, their voices haunting and beautiful. "I never thanked you properly," Sarah said eventually. "Not just for saving me from Miller, but for bringing me here in the first place. If you hadn't given me this chance, you would have found another way," Thomas said with certainty. "You're stronger than you know, Sarah Morgan." She smiled at his faith in her. "Perhaps. But I'm glad it was this way. I'm glad it was you." Thomas turned to face her, his expression serious in the fading light. "Sarah, I know you're still healing. I know it might be too soon. But I care for you more than I should, maybe." Sarah's heart pounded. "Thomas, you don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I just wanted you to know. Whatever you decide, wherever life takes you, you'll never be left behind again. Not by me." The words echoed in her mind, healing something broken inside her. This man, with his quiet strength and unwavering integrity, had seen her at her most vulnerable and still found her worthy of respect and care. Slowly, Sarah reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. It was a small gesture, but in it was the promise of possibility of a future where trust could be rebuilt and love could grow from the ashes of betrayal. "Thank you," she whispered. As autumn approached, the ranch settled into a different rhythm. The days grew shorter, the air crisper, and preparations for winter began in earnest. Sarah found herself increasingly comfortable in her role, no longer just the cook but a valued member of the ranch community. Her relationship with Thomas developed gradually, built on mutual respect and shared moments. They were careful, both aware of the scrutiny of others and the lingering shadows of Sarah's past. But each day brought them closer, each conversation deepening their connection. One crisp October morning, Mr. Prescott called Sarah to the main house. She found him in his study, looking unusually formal behind his desk. "Mrs. Morgan," he began, "you've been with us nearly 5 months now." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, wondering if he was dissatisfied with her work. "In that time, You've proven yourself not just a fine cook, but a woman of remarkable character. He cleared his throat. My late wife would have liked you. She always said this place needed a woman's touch. Sarah was touched by the rare personal comment. Thank you, Mr. Prescott. I'm getting older, he continued. This business with Blackwell made me realize I need to consider the future of Pine Ridge. He shuffled some papers on his desk. I've decided to make Thomas a partner in the ranch. He's earned it after all these years. Sarah smiled. That's wonderful news. Thomas deserves recognition for his dedication. Indeed. Prescott studied her. And what about you, Mrs. Morgan? Do you see your future here at Pine Ridge? The question caught her off guard. I haven't thought much beyond the present, sir. Perhaps you should. His expression softened slightly. Thomas is a good man. Best I've ever known. And I've seen how he looks at you. Sarah felt her cheeks warm. Mr. Prescott, he raised a hand. Not my business, I know. Just an old man's observation. He straightened in his chair. I've had the cook's quarters expanded and improved. New floor, bigger windows, proper stove for heating. Should be finished by the end of the week. That's very generous, Sarah said, surprised by this unexpected kindness. You've earned it, Prescott replied simply. That'll be all, Mrs. Morgan. As winter descended on Pine Ridge, Sarah found herself more content than she'd ever been. The expanded quarters were warm and comfortable, giving her a true home for the first time since leaving Clearwater Springs. Her relationship with Thomas had deepened into something precious, though still unspoken in many ways. They were riding together one December afternoon, checking on a distant pasture where some of the cattle were wintering. Snow blanketed the landscape, transforming the familiar terrain into something magical. Their breath fogged in the cold air as their horses picked their way carefully through the drifts. My father taught me to ride when I was 6, Sarah said, continuing a conversation about their childhoods. He said every girl should know how to sit a horse properly, even if society said otherwise. Thomas smiled. He sounds like a wise man. My father wasn't around much. Learned most of what I know from other cowboys. You never talk about your family, Sarah observed. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Not much to tell. Father drank himself to death when I was 12. Mother followed a year later consumption, the doctor said, but I think it was grief. Been on my own since then. Sarah's heart ached for the boy he'd been. I'm sorry. He shrugged. Made me who I am. Taught me to value the right things. His eyes met hers. Like honesty, loyalty. They crested a hill, and Thomas reined his horse to a stop. Before them stretched a vista of untouched snow, pine trees heavy with white, and mountains rising majestically in the distance. This is why I love it here, Thomas said softly. No matter what troubles men create, this land reminds us how small we really are. Sarah nodded, understanding perfectly. The beauty before them was humbling, a reminder of life's true scale and meaning. Thomas turned in his saddle to face her, his expression suddenly serious. Sarah, there's something I've been wanting to ask you. Her heart quickened. Yes. I know it hasn't been that long since everything happened with your husband, and I'd understand if you need more time. But these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. He took a deep breath. I love you, Sarah Morgan. I think I have since that first day you stood in the general store, determined to make your own way despite everything. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, not of sadness, but of a joy so pure it was almost painful. If you'll have me, Thomas continued, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, I'd like to court you properly, with the intention of marriage when you're ready. For a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. The wounds James had inflicted still ached occasionally, reminders of trust betrayed and promises broken. But Thomas had shown her, through countless actions both large and small, that he was a man of his word, a man who valued her strength as much as he wished to protect her. "Thomas," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion, "I would be honored." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. He reached across the space between their horses to take her gloved hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that was both gallant and deeply sincere. As they rode back to the ranch, side by side in the fading winter light, Sarah felt a sense of rightness settle over her. What James had broken, Thomas was helping to heal, not by erasing the past, but by showing her that it need not define her future. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers and renewed energy across the ranch. The cattle drives began again, though Thomas arranged for another experienced hand to lead some of them so he could remain closer to Pine Ridge and to Sarah. Their courtship progressed with a sweetness that sometimes took Sarah's breath away. Thomas was attentive without being possessive, respectful of her independence while making his devotion clear. The entire ranch seemed to approve, especially Mr. Prescott, who had taken to inviting them both to supper in the main house regularly. On a warm May evening, Thomas took Sarah to a special spot he'd discovered years ago, a small meadow beside a clear stream, sheltered by cottonwoods. He'd prepared a picnic, complete with a bottle of wine Mr. Prescott had contributed when he learned of Thomas's plans. "It's beautiful here," Sarah said, leaning back against a tree trunk as they finished their meal. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground. Thomas moved to sit beside her, taking her hand. "Not as beautiful as you." Sarah laughed softly. "Mr. Evans, I do believe you're becoming poetic." "Your fault entirely, Mrs. Morgan." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "You inspire all kinds of unfamiliar feelings in me." Their eyes met, and Sarah saw in his gaze all the love and desire he'd held in check for so long. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, Thomas leaned forward and brushed his lips against hers. The kiss was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. Sarah responded with a surety that surprised her, her hand coming up to touch his face. Thomas deepened the kiss, drawing her closer, and Sarah felt herself melting into him, all the careful boundaries they'd maintained dissolving in the warmth of their embrace. When they finally parted, both breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for so long," he confessed. "Why did you wait?" Sarah asked softly. "I needed you to be sure." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Your husband hurt you badly. I didn't want to rush you." The consideration in his words, the patient understanding of her healing process, confirmed what Sarah had already come to believe, that this man was worthy of the trust her heart had already given him. "I am sure," she said firmly. "I love you, Thomas Evans." Joy blazed in his eyes at her declaration. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. "I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment." Sarah's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small, perfect sapphire. "Sarah Morgan," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face. "You came into my life when I least expected it and showed me what it means to truly care for someone. Your strength, your kindness, your determination, everything about you has captured my heart completely." He took a deep breath. "Would you do me the tremendous honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of happiness spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the blue stone catching the evening light. "It was my mother's," he explained. "The only thing of hers I kept all these years. I always hoped I'd find someone worthy of wearing it someday." Sarah looked at the ring, then back at the man who had given her not just a beautiful piece of jewelry, but a second chance at happiness. "I'll treasure it always," she promised, "just as I'll treasure you." They returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, hands clasped and hearts full. Mr. Prescott was waiting on the porch, a knowing smile on his weathered face, when he spotted the ring glinting on Sarah's finger. "About time," the old rancher said gruffly, but his eyes were warm as he shook Thomas's hand and kissed Sarah's cheek. "This calls for the good whiskey." News of their engagement spread quickly through the ranch. The cowboys offered hearty congratulations, some looking genuinely emotional at the prospect of their foreman finding happiness. Preparations for the wedding began immediately, with a date set for midsummer. Letters were exchanged with Harriet from Clearwater Springs, who promised to attend along with a few other friends Sarah had made during her time there. Thomas's circle was smaller, just the men of Pine Ridge whom he'd worked alongside for years. "I wish your parents could be here," Sarah said one evening as they sat on the porch, discussing the ceremony. Thomas smiled wistfully. "My mother would have adored you. She always said I needed someone strong enough to match my stubbornness." Sarah laughed. A wise woman indeed. As the wedding day approached, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. James's betrayal, which had once seemed like the end of her world, now appeared as a necessary crossroads, painful, yes, but ultimately leading her toward a truer happiness than she'd ever known. The ceremony took place on a perfect July day, with wildflowers decorating the ranch house and every surface polished to a shine. Sarah wore a dress of pale blue silk that Harriet had helped her select, with Thomas's mother's sapphire ring catching the light as she recited her vows. Thomas, standing tall and proud in a new suit, looked at her with such tenderness that several of the hardened cowboys were seen wiping their eyes. Mr. Prescott gave the bride away, his usual gruffness softened by the evident pleasure he took in this union. "By the power vested in me," the minister concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Thomas gathered Sarah gently into his arms, his kiss a promise of all the years to come. The assembled guests cheered as they turned to face them, Mr. and Mrs. Evans at last. The celebration continued well into the night, with music and dancing, food and drink flowing freely. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, creating a magical glow. Sarah found herself swept from partner to partner as the cowboys each claimed a dance with the new Mrs. Evans, while Thomas watched with pride shining in his eyes. Finally reunited with her husband, Sarah leaned against him as they swayed to a slow melody. "Happy," Thomas murmured against her hair. "Completely," she replied, lifting her face for his kiss. "And you? More than I ever thought possible." His arms tightened around her. "I promise you, Sarah Evans, every day of our lives together, I'll do my best to be worthy of you." "You already are," she assured him. "You always have been." Later, as they prepared to leave for the small cabin Thomas had renovated as their home, a wedding gift from Mr. Prescott, the old rancher pulled them aside for a private word. "I've had my lawyer draw these up," he said, handing Thomas an envelope. "Deed to the north section of the ranch, 200 acres. Wedding present." Thomas stared at the papers in shock. "Mr. Prescott, this is too much nonsense," the older man interrupted. "No children of my own to leave it to. You've been like a son to me, Thomas. And now Sarah's the daughter I never had." His voice grew gruff with emotion. "Want to see you two build something lasting. Family belongs on land of their own." Sarah embraced the startled rancher, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." As they rode toward their new home in the moonlight, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at how completely her life had transformed in just over a year. From the devastation of abandonment to the joy of true partnership, from loneliness to belonging, from uncertainty to purpose. Thomas helped her down from her horse when they reached the cabin, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Inside, he had prepared everything perfectly: fresh flowers on the table, a fire laid ready in the hearth, the bed turned down invitingly. "Welcome home, Mrs. Evans," he said softly, setting her on her feet but keeping his arms around her. Sarah looked up at him, this man who had shown her what love truly meant, not through grand gestures, but through daily kindness, unwavering respect, and gentle strength. "I love you, Thomas," she said simply. "With all my heart." His answering kiss was tender and passionate at once, beginning the first night of their life together with a promise that would never be broken. In the years that followed, Pine Ridge flourished under Thomas and Sarah's care. The 200 acres Mr. Prescott had given them expanded as they gradually purchased adjacent land, building one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory. Their family grew as well. Their first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Thomas's mother, arrived less than a year after their wedding. She was followed by a son, William Marshall Evans, named in honor of Mr. Prescott, who doted on both children as if they were his own grandchildren. When Prescott passed peacefully in his sleep during the children's 5th winter, he left the remainder of Pine Ridge to Thomas and Sarah, having long since considered them his true family. They honored his memory by continuing his legacy of fair dealing and good stewardship of the land. Clearwater Springs grew into a proper town, with a railroad connection that brought new opportunities. Occasionally, Sarah would visit with Thomas and the children, holding her head high as she walked the streets where she had once felt such shame. James Morgan's name was rarely mentioned, and when it was rumors said he'd ended up in a California prison after one scheme too many, Sarah felt nothing but a distant pity for the man who had once been her husband. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Sarah with a trip to San Francisco, a journey she had once dreamed of making with James, but now experienced with a man whose love had never wavered. Was it worth the wait? Thomas asked as they stood on a hill overlooking the bay, the city spread out below them in all its bustling glory. Sarah leaned into his embrace, thinking of all they had built together, their ranch, their family, their love that had only deepened with each passing year. "Some things," she replied, turning in his arms to kiss him, "are worth waiting a lifetime for." As they returned to Pine Ridge, to the land and the life they had created together, Sarah reflected on that desperate day when James had abandoned her, how what had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning. How sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us to the best if we have the courage to keep moving forward. And she thought of Thomas's words on that fateful day when he had saved her from Miller, words that had proven true through every trial and triumph they had faced together. "You'll never be left behind again." Not a promise of perfect happiness or freedom from life's hardships, but something far more valuable, the assurance that whatever came, they would face it together, equal partners in the journey. That, Sarah had learned, was the truest definition of love.